we'll do is we'll start with Remington. Will kick us off in a minute and just giving us an overview of Burgundy. Obviously, we have varying levels of knowledge of all the guests that have joined us. So I think just a brief recap and an overview is always handy. And then we'll get straight into it with Guillaume and obviously keep things as interactive as possible. So just in terms of our involvement, obviously we've been proudly importing Domaine d'Angeville's wines into South Africa, and the first vintage was the 2000 vintage, which by pure coincidence is the vintage that is currently in Remington's glass, because just off air, I suppose, we were just discussing what we were drinking, so that was well chosen, Remington. And no, so it's been one of the domains that we've worked with the longest. So it's a domain that's very special to us. Guillaume's become a great friend. We've managed to convince him to come to South Africa once, hopefully another time once we're all allowed to travel again. And that's something that we hope to do sometime in the near future. And I think as a domain, it's sort of a hot topic in the fine wine world at the moment. I think everyone is aware that prices are sort of generally escalating, and it really is sort of a hotbed for some of the finest wines in the world. And I think d'Angeville has been a domain that has, over the years and up until now, been one that's firmly kept their feet on the ground and always been about wine people and making wine for people to drink and keep it as accessible as possible, which is something we've always appreciated and something that the clients have also appreciated. So long may it continue, and with Guillaume there, I'm hopeful that we can continue on this path because it's very important. And then Remington, as I say, is a dear friend. Obviously met him through my partner in the business, Wayne Visser, who's joined us today, and I'm sure he'll have some questions and join us on the video later. And Remington's been a great help to Great Domains from the early days when I wasn't yet involved, to introducing us to a few domains and generally helping us drink bottles of wine, which is the important part. And it's been a long journey, and we've really valued his input at tastings and around dinner tables. And obviously, Remington, we really appreciate you joining us today. And yeah, looking forward to it. So that's pretty much it for me, just from an introduction point of view. And I'll let you, I know Christine's just going to pop up the presentation. And as I said, please, if there's any questions on the chat side, please can you type them in, and I'll just monitor it, and we'll try and, as I say, answer everything and do what we need to do. So everyone must enjoy it, and yeah, Remington, please take it away, and I'm sure Christine will pop up with that presentation. Enjoy it, everyone.
Okay. Oh. Hi, I hope everybody can see me. I can't see all of you, but welcome. It's wonderful to have this event, and particularly to have Guillaume here. I've known Guillaume and his father over the years. It's a wonderful domain, and it's a joy to be able to talk about the wines. And I hope some of you've got, I'm seeing some glasses there with a little bit of Burgundy of various sorts in, so that's a wonderful start. My brief is to give a snapshot of, excuse me, a snapshot of Burgundy, to talk about vineyards, to talk about the classification, how it's organized, grapes, producers, and the general ethos of Burgundy. I've got 10 minutes to do this. It would normally take about 3 hours, so forgive me if I'm going a bit quickly. Can we have the first slide, please? I'm going to, first of all, and I know many of you have been to Burgundy, but perhaps some of you haven't. I just want to situate it. If you look here, you've got Chablis on the left, which is north of Burgundy. You come down to Dijon. This is really where we're focused here on the Côte d'Or, the Golden Slope, which is the 56 kilometers, just to give you an idea of scale, between Dijon and Santenay and Marange. That is the Côte d'Or. Beneath it, you have the Côte Chalonnaise and Mercure and all the rest of those other subsidiary things, but we're not involved with those today. Volnay, you can see if you look down the right hand there, Volnay is sandwiched, a lovely filling in the sandwich, the other bits of which are Pommard and Merceau. Yeah, sorry, we've got to do that. Yeah, so it's just there. If we can go to the next slide, please, which is Burgundy is special because the slopes of Burgundy and the soils of Burgundy have been formed over many, many millennia, and they're very varied. And if you look at this, this is a schematic diagram. It doesn't represent anything, but the point is that the geology, it's rather like if you think of a French baguette that was pulled. On one side, you've got the slopes of Burgundy, and the other side, you've got the plain. And these slopes here, this very narrow 56 kilometers of slopes, the width goes from about a few hundred meters to a kilometer and a half. I'm sure Guillaume will correct me with some more exact figures, but that's about it. And within this, you've got a huge hierarchy of vineyards. And the important thing is, as this thing shows here, flatter land tends to be the regional appellations: Bourgogne Rouge, Bourgogne Blanc, red Burgundy, white Burgundy. And on those, they are allowed to put the grape varieties. So Bourgogne Pinot Noir or Bourgogne Chardonnay, whatever it happens to be. Now, above that, you've got the communal applications, which are the villages. And the villages are the ones on that map. There are about 23 villages. And so if it's a Volnay, comes with these vineyards, it's entitled to call Volnay, and that's it, Volnay tout court. That's the end of the story. Going up the slopes, you've got the Premier Cru and the Grand Cru. These vineyards over the centuries, and it was really the monks, viticulture started in Burgundy in Roman times. They dug up the archaeological evidence, but it was the monks really in the Middle Ages who came and discovered the vineyards, planted. They needed wine for their religious offices and obviously for themselves to drink. Burgundy winters can be pretty brutal. You need something heartwarming. So they codified the vineyards. They found the vineyards that were the best vineyards. This evolved over the centuries. Some vineyard plots regularly produced better wines than others. So you've got this classification. The classification is the regional, communal application, village appellations. Then you've got the Premier Crus and the Grand Crus. And so that is the way that it's organized. The difficulty, it gets more complicated because first of all, there are only 32, 33 Grand Crus, depending on how you count them. You don't automatically get a Grand Cru because you're a village. And those Grand Crus, they are the summit of potential. No, they're not the summit of quality, they're the potential for quality. And if you can produce great wine from those Grand Crus, the wine is great. But a lot of people have Grand Cru vineyards and don't produce great wine. So that is, the Grand Cru is the potential. Premier Crus also, the important thing though to remember, and further complicated by the fact that vineyards have multiple owners. That does not mean a whole lot of people own the whole vineyard. Each person has his own strip of vines. So to take the absurd example of Clos Vougeot, which is 50 hectares, is owned by 82 people. So you can, as we did in London some years ago, line up 50 or 60 Clos Vougeots in the same vintage, and you get everything from the sublime to not quite the ridiculous, but the not very good. So you've got this difficulty with vineyards, that there is this classification and the vineyards are split. So at the end of this, really the key is the producer. And it's very, very important to understand that the producer is the key. And my analogy, it's rather like if you're buying food, it's much better to buy a hamburger from a Michelin 3-star chef than to buy some complicated dish from somebody who hasn't a clue what they're doing. So at the end of the day, it's the producer that is your yardstick of quality. And if you find a producer whose wines you like, you can never, usually not get a bad bottle from them. I mean, so I'm certainly, I can say this, Guillaume won't say it, but I can say it, I've never had a bad bottle from Domaine d'Angerville. So you rely on the producer as your yardstick of quality. As Derek said, the prices of Burgundy have escalated enormously over recent years. So really the buying trick is to find the producer and buy at a level that you think you can afford. The top wines have become hideously expensive and for most people. So you've got to try and play it a little bit clever with this. Look at producers, look at a Bourgogne Rouge from a good producer is much better than a Grand Cru from an incompetent. Right, this is where Volnay is situated. I know Guillaume's going to talk more about Volnay. It's very interesting because the soil, and I don't want to go into the geology, all this faulting, but the soil, the bedrock, there are two things. One, the bedrock and the soil. The bedrock is mostly limestone, but limestone varies enormously in type and quality, and that influences the quality of what ends up in the bottle. What happened is that the older limestone rocks from the north of the Côte, from Gevrey and Moray, they disappeared just south of Louis Saint-Georges, and re-emerge just in the middle of Meursault. In Volnay, some of the younger limestones come to the surface, and that accounts for the quality of Volnay. And Volnay, really, if there's an epithet Volnay, it is finesse. Pinot Noir is particularly a grape which delivers finesse. It delivers silkiness, it delivers richness at the same time. And what I would love Guillaume to talk a little bit about, because it's, I think, something much misunderstood, that people think that lightness, and bear in mind Pinot Noir has 2/3 of the pigmentation of other red grapes such as Cabernet and Shiraz, they're never very deeply colored. So it's important not to confuse lightness of color with lightness of flavor. You can have huge intensity and concentration from wines that look as though they're almost like rosés. In fact, some of the best Burgundies I've drunk, old Burgundies, you open the bottle and it looks like a brick-colored rosé, and the wines are massively aromatic and massively concentrated. So to talk about lightness and also to talk about precision. And the great thing with Volnay is the wines are precise. You don't blend, there's no blending, there's no other grape involved. It's obviously Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And the wines, if you look at, and Guillaume will talk about these various vineyards, the wines are precise, and it's that wonderful definition, that direction, that precision, which makes these wines so magical. If you're tasting them, yes, they occasionally, from some of the vineyards, they can be quite taut. They can be quite austere. I have no problem at all with austerity, except perhaps macroeconomics, but we're not talking about macroeconomics. Austerity is fine in wine for me because it means if the wine's got the fruit, it is then going to go through an age. So it really is important to look at these things in the context of the vineyards in which they are produced. I don't think I want to say an awful lot more for the moment. I think that this is all about Guillaume and Domaine d'Angerville. We'll learn a lot more as we go along. But if there are questions, please fire them back when Derek gives you the signal. Guillaume, over to you.
Thank you very much, Remington. Thank you, Derek, Wayne, and the team at Great Domains for this opportunity for me to speak to you all from Volnay, where the sun is shining, the weather is beautiful, while the flower is taking place in the vineyard. So we are very excited about vintage 2020. You know, 2020 in French is, you say it, you pronounce it vin, vin, which means wine, wine. So it has to be a great vintage ahead of us with such a name. Anyway, Remington, thank you very much for the introduction to Burgundy. Like you say, it's a tall order to discuss Burgundy in 10 minutes, but you did a great job. I want to focus on the village of Volnay first before focusing on my estate specifically. You have here in front of you the map of the village, and in the pink areas are the plots that I own and that I farm. You have to understand that Volnay is in the middle of the Côte de Beaune. The Côte d'Or vineyards are separated between Côte de Nuit and Côte de Beaune, and for the reasons that Remington explained earlier, Volnay produces wines that have a very specific style, which is often described as finesse or femininity, elegance, notably when compared to Côte de Nuit wines, where you expect something perhaps more voluminous, perhaps more structured. Here in Volnay, we don't look for a huge structure necessarily. We are looking for something precise, fine, almost ethereal in the way that the wines evolve. The village itself is a small village in the scale of Burgundy. If you see here sort of the light brown on the map, sorry, Christine, if we can go back, the light brown area is the size, is the Volnay Premier Cru area. It's only 110 hectares. 110 hectares. About 50 producers share those 110 hectares. And just to a sense of scale, Chateau Latour on its own in Bordeaux is 110 hectares. I always like to show that comparison to see how Burgundy is so much different from Bordeaux. And I am honored and privileged to own about 11.5 hectares of Volnay Premier Cru, so just about 10% of the entire acreage of Volnay, which probably makes me the largest holder. And I take no credit for it, of course. I was privileged because I inherited this estate from my father, and this estate has been in my family for 200 years now. In fact, I can now move maybe perhaps and say 215 years. 1804 was when my ancestor purchased the estate right after the French Revolution. And it's been in the same family for all these years. And I'm only the 6th generation running the estate. It's been run by a family member ever since it was purchased in 1804. And the really important man, the really important generation in the estate, in the history of the estate, is my grandfather, Sem. S-E-M is his first name. He arrived at the estate at the very beginning of the 20th century. And he proceeded to replant the estate entirely. Yes, you know, Burgundy had been destroyed by phylloxera at the end of the 19th century. And therefore, when my grandfather arrived at the beginning of the 20th century, he actually found a place which was in very, very bad shape. Most of the vines had been eaten up by this insect, and therefore the vineyards were destroyed. And so he proceeded to replant the estate almost entirely. And we owe him today the quality of the estate and also its reputation. I want to say one quick word about him because he deserves some credit for Burgundy as a whole, because in the 1920s and 30s, he started being very upset by the fact that the wine merchants in Beaune, who were buying his wine in bulk in barrels, were mixing his wines with other wines produced in other areas of France and still calling it Volnay. And he became very upset with that, and he started suing the wine merchants for ill practices, for fraud. And as a result of that, of course, the merchants became very upset and said to him that they were no longer going to buy his wines. And as a result of that, the silver lining of all this is that he was one of the first in Burgundy, together with a few others, to start estate bottling, so bottling on the estate, as opposed to selling almost the entirety of the production to the trade in bulk. And then the wines were bottled by other people. So and he became very famous for that, for that fight against the fraud and for what he called authentic wines. And to the point that in 1935, he was asked actually to write down the hierarchy that Remington talked about earlier, which is the classification between regional appellation to communal appellation to premier cru to grand cru. And he wrote that classification for the entirety of Côte d'Or, Côte de Beaune and Côte de Nuit, together with his friend Henri Gouge from Domaine Henri Gouge in Nuit Saint-Georges. And those two gentlemen made it clear from the first day that they were charged with this mission that they were going to speak for the general interest and not for their own interest. And they said, therefore, don't expect a Grand Cru in Volnay or in Nuit Saint-Georges, because there won't be one, because we want to show you that we have a totally ethical approach to the hierarchy and we don't want to play our own cards, which I think is a wonderful story. I've heard this story many times from my father, but Henri Gouge's grandsons have heard the same story on their side. So I think it's a valid one. It's a valid one. So here we are in Volnay, my estate. If you see the church right in the middle of that picture, to the right of that church is the Clos des Ducs, and that's where I'm sitting right now in the house. That is that you cannot really see. Yeah, exactly, Christine. It's close enough. That's where I'm sitting now, and you see this particular vineyard, Clos des Ducs, and you see the slope looking south is almost as steep as the slope looking east. I don't know if Christine can show us with the arrow. Well, that's also another way to look at it. But you see that this is a double sloping vineyard. And here, this is taken from the top of the estate the top of the Clos des Ducs, and my house is that big white house that you see on the right-hand side ahead of the village. And here you see the slope facing east. In the horizon there, on a good day, you can see the Mont Blanc actually quite clearly. It's only 250 kilometers birds fly, I think you call it, birds fly, direct from my garden to the Mont Blanc is about 250 kilometers. And we can see it some days, it's beautiful. And here you see what Remington was talking about a typical vineyard of Burgundy, of Volnay, where the bedrock is limestone. It's only maybe 1 meter of topsoil before the mother rock, which is limestone. And then the soil itself is a combination of limestone and clay. In this particular vineyard here, the content of limestone is higher, and the soil is actually quite stony and quite white. We call them white marls, M-A-R-L-S. And that's I would say, generally speaking, the type of soil that we find in Burgundy. Now here in Volnay, we make those wines which Remington described as precise, clean, elegant. We have, because of that particular soil that we have. But the interesting thing about Volnay is, in fact, the village sits in between 2 hills. This is, you can see here behind the house is the northern hill, and there's another hill at the other side of the village. And there's been some very active tectonic, very strong tectonic activity 30 million years ago, which created actually Côte de Beaune, Côte de Nuit. But then there were secondary faults, secondary earthquakes, if you will, that moved the topsoil so that there is a very diverse style of soil, even 100 meters apart. That's the beauty of Burgundy. That's what the monks actually found out. It is that from 100 meters apart, you can produce actually different wines, and therefore you should call them a different name. And therefore we have more than 1,200 different names of wines in this tiny piece of land that Remington also described, only 56 kilometers long, maybe 1 kilometer, 1.5 kilometer wide. So very small area, but more than 1,200 different names of wines, of areas, so that people actually link the wine to the place where the wine is produced. And if I want one message to be clear about what Burgundy is all about, it's the fact that nowhere else in the wine world has man shown such determination to link the wine to the place where the wine is produced. An American wine writer called Matt Kramer called that somewhereness, the place, the sense of place. And of course, the fact that we have only one varietal, which is Pinot Noir in red wines and Chardonnay in white wines, really means that the differences in the wines come from the soil. And if I may add to what Remington said about choosing the producer, it's very kind to say this, but to me, the first thing is the terroir, of course. You know, if I have a choice, I prefer to hide behind the terroir. My role is to facilitate the birth of the wine, but not to alter what the terroir brings to the wine. I think Remington agrees, I'm sure he knows what I mean by that. But it's very important for me to give this message about the link between the place and the wine. And here in Volnay, between those 2 hills, we have a variety, of course, of different soils. If we can go back to the map, maybe Christine, is that possible? And I will, yeah, so, closer to, yes, that's great. So if you go from the top to the bottom, you will see that there are 3 pink areas to the north. That's the north hill of the village between Volnay and Pommard. This is Clos-des-Ducs. What Christine is showing you is Clos-des-Ducs. It's 2.15 hectares. And then Fremier is a little bit further north. It's mid-height on the hill, and Clos des Angles is lower down on the hill. It's only separated by a small dirt road, but the simple fact that the Clos des Angles is at the bottom of the hill, almost flat, whereas Fremier is quite steep and hit by erosion. The two wines are very, very different. Fremier is a lot more mineral wine. There's only maybe 50 centimeters of soil before the mother rock. The vines have to really work hard to find food and water through the mother rock. Whereas in Clos des Angles, which actually collected the soil from the erosion from Fremier, which is above it, there is quite a deep soil there. There's quite a good content of clay in that soil. And as a result of that, Clos des Angles is quite a lacy style of wine. The structure is minimal because the vines have less work to do to find the food that they need to produce great wines. So that's I would say I always like to show those two wines in a row because it really shows the mystery of Burgundy, that those two adjacent plots would produce such different wines. Now, if we move to the South Hill, which is around Taillepied, to the south of the village, below the village on that map, Taillepied is roughly the same height, the same altitude as Clos-des-Ducs, but is on the southern hill. It faces plain east, and it's in the wind, whereas Clos-des-Ducs is actually quite sheltered from the wind by the village and by the woods above. Taillepied is in the wind. It's definitely a kind of a colder climate style of wine, a little bit more austere than the rest of the range. And below it, to the right on the map, is Champagne, which I have in my glass here, Champagne 17. I took this because I always like to drink Champagne when I talk about Volnay, because to me, and Remington will correct me if he disagrees, but to me, Champagne is really perhaps the benchmark style of what Volnay is all about. Always a very feminine style of wine, very curvy, very silky, very soft, but yet very seductive and appealing. I'm lucky to own 4 hectares of that particular vineyard, Volnay Champagne, which in total is 11 hectares. So to go back to Remington's point, there's another 7 producers of Volnay Champagne. I'm the largest by a long shot, but there are 7 other people who produce champagnes, some great champagnes, some not so great champagnes, depending on who you talk about. And then below is Volnay Cailleret, where I inherited the longer bit at the top, and I was able to buy this very tiny triangle there, which increased my production by 50%. So it looks very small. It's a quarter of a hectare, that little triangle, but it increases the production of Cailleret from the estate by 50%. So overall, 11.5 hectares of Volnay Premier Cru, perhaps roughly half a hectare of Volnay Village, and then Bourgogne Rouge, Bourgogne Blanc, Bourgogne Aligoté, Bourgogne Passe-Grain. I make a point of producing all those different wines, regional appellations, even the Passe-Grain and the Aligoté, which are less well known and less profitable, of course, because they are cheaper wines. They are made in the flatlands on the village of Volnay as well, but in land which is less that has less potential to make great wines, and therefore that's where we have regional appellations. But it's very important for me to have that production too, because I think it's a way to show people, to give people a chance of an introduction to the estate. Derek made a point at the beginning of the session about the price of Burgundy, and here again I would like to perhaps slightly tone down what he said. I think the price of Côte de Nuit wines have continued to escalate to ridiculous prices, but the prices of red Côte de Beaune wines have continued to remain very reasonable. In fact, the price gap has tended to increase, whereas I think the quality gap has narrowed very significantly over the years. And I don't, you know, I'm not angry or bitter about it. I'm very happy with my life, and I feel very privileged. But I take it as I'm really happy about Derek's comments about the fact that my wines are the affordability of them is acceptable. So that's good. That's good. I want my wines to be drunk. That's for sure. There's sometimes, you know, private collectors show me their cellars with great pride, and I see a bottle of Claude de Luc there, nicely put in a little cabinet, and they say, "Oh, look at this," and I say, "But you know, this is to be drunk. This is that's not a statue. It's not a piece of art. It's a liquid that needs to be drunk at some point." This is a view of my cellar, not the most. This is where I put the new wines. When, for example, right now in that particular cellar is vintage 18, which we just finished bottling about 3 or 4 weeks ago, which needs me. I don't know. Am I doing okay on timing, Derek?
That's perfect, Guillaume. That's absolutely perfect.
So I can continue talking. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Please, thanks.
Okay. So this, I said we just finished bottling the 18 vintage, which leads me to say that generally speaking, the élevage in barrel lasts about 18 months. We generally bottle between March and May, between late February and May, let's say, the vintage of the previous year. So the élevage takes place in wood barrels, of course. We have an average of new oak, which is quite low, which has to do with the particularities also of the village of Volnay, where the wines being so delicate and delicate, they would not accept too much new wood. The new wood and excess new wood would actually overwhelm the wines, and therefore the wine would tend to disappear behind the wood. So I'm right now around 20%, give and take, between the different Premier Crus. And frankly speaking, I am tempted to make tests with even lower content of new oak. The trick, of course, there, if you decide to go that route, is to find enough 1-year-old oak or 2-year-old oak from people who you trust entirely that they have taken care of the barrels properly. So if we go backwards, we harvest, of course, manually. We have a team of pickers, which I have chosen to increase quite significantly from the time of my father, because since all my vineyards, as you saw on the map, are very close to one another, they are all actually ripe almost at the same time. And therefore, it's important to have kind of a military operation for the harvest, so that everything is inside the winery maybe within 1 week or so. It's very important. So and the time of the harvest is one of the most difficult decisions to make in the life of a winemaker. It's very tricky because it determines a number of things. In fact, it determines if the wine is going to be harmonious or not, basically, because you have to be sure that you harvest ripe berries, of course, but not overripe, because there's nothing worse than an overripe Pinot Noir. It really becomes very jammy and very uninteresting and heavy. So if you want to keep that acidity, you want to keep that tension in the wine, and yet you want full ripeness, including what we call the phenolic ripeness, which is everything other than the sugar ripeness, if I want to generalize and make things simple, more simple than they really are, but generally speaking, that's the idea. So it's important to talk about this a little bit, because in the context of climate change, that decision, which is the harvest date, has been made even more complex than before. And why is that? It's because of the climate change, we now harvest a lot earlier than before. Since I took over the estate from my father, when my father passed away 17 years ago now, in the last 17 years, I have made the 8 most precocious, the 8 earliest harvests in the history of the domain since my grandfather arrived in 1905. So in the space of 17 years, the 8 most precocious harvests in the history of the domain. So it tells you something about climate change, or at least that we are within a period of time where the climate is warmer than it was. When I was a child, and I will accept that it's quite a while ago now, but when I was a child 50 years ago, we used to harvest never before, you know, the end of September, and many times we harvested in October. And yet we did not harvest fully ripe grapes. Today, we harvest most of the time on around between the 1st and the 10th of September, and the grapes that we harvest are totally ripe. So climate change has actually been good to us to that extent. I hate to admit this because I'm very worried about the climate change, but I have to accept the fact that it's given Burgundy a chance to actually reach full maturity every year for the last 17 years. And therefore the process of chaptalization, which is adding sugar when there's a deficit of alcohol in the grapes, it has been completely abandoned. I have not added sugar ever since I took over the estate in the last 17 years. So it's a huge shift in the way that the Burgundy wines are now produced. And I have to say that I've been comfortable with that so far, but vintage 18 and vintage 19 are to me kind of a breaking point where we saw enormous levels of natural sugar in the wines, at levels which start to be a little bit more worrying. And I would hope that we are going to go back in the next few years to lower levels again, because we can see that the yeasts are having a difficult time to eat all that sugar to turn it into alcohol. But here this year in 2020, we if everything goes according to plan, we are again going to be harvesting very early, probably before August is over.
Guillaume, just one quick little technical question, sorry for interrupting your flow. One of the questions that just come up was if you wouldn't mind doing a short elaboration on the timing of the malolactic fermentations and the sort of racking regime over the 18 months. That was just one of the questions.
Yep. So malolactic fermentation, which is called the malolactic fermentation, is actually not a fermentation. It's just a transformation of acids in the wine. But it takes place. We want it to take place naturally. It takes place naturally. But it varies a great deal from one vintage to the next when it actually takes place. And I have seen vintages in my very short experience at the estate, only 17 years. I say only because, you know, my father made 52 harvests in a row, so I'm still a rookie almost. But I have seen all the extremes in terms of malolactic fermentation timing. In fact, in vintage 18 that I was telling you about, the malolactic fermentation took place at the same time as the alcoholic fermentation during vinification, not in the barrel, which is an extreme. And the other extreme, I think, was in I think it was in 04 and again in 08. I would have to look up my notes, but the malolactic took place after the following harvest was actually in the cellar. So it varies a great deal, but it's very important to realize that transformation of acid actually destabilizes the wine during the élevage. And therefore, if you have a very late malolactic, then you tend to have a late bottling because you want the wines to resettle post-malolactic fermentation. But generally speaking, the rule of thumb is that malolactic fermentation takes place in the spring following the harvest. So for example, right now, the 19s have finished their malolactic fermentation, and they will be racked after the malolactic fermentation when we move the wines from below the winery to another cellar to make room for the following vintage. So in the month of July, next month, or in 6 weeks' time, we will be moving vintage 19 from the cellars, which are just below the winery, to another cellar below the house, where they will finish the élevage. And therefore, the cellars just below the winery will be again ready. These are those cellars. If you step back, this is the cellar just below the winery, where right now vintage 19 is in, and I will be moving those wines into another cellar to make room for vintage 2020 in the month of July, and we will rack them. So we put all the barrels of one cuvée into one big stainless steel tank. We clean, we rack, and we put back into the same barrels in that other cellar. We move the barrels empty, of course. We don't move the barrels full.
Fantastic.
Here is I wanted Christine to show that label for a number of different reasons. The first one is when my grandfather inherited this estate, he was about 30 years old, and he was an artist. He was an engraver by background. He went to the School of Fine Arts in Paris, and the first thing he did when he arrived at the estate was to replant, like I said, to replant the estate, but he also designed that label. That label is unchanged since 1905. It's exactly the same setting, it's the same font, it's the same red dot at the top right-hand corner, and he invented that Volnay-Angerville, Vendée-Duc de Bourgogne. He invented the font of Monopole. Everything is his. My father used the same, and of course I continue to use it because I find it absolutely wonderful that it was created by my grandfather and that it is so distinctive still today, and in fact very modern today, in spite of the fact that it's 110 years old. The other thing I wanted to say about this label is that it says Monopole here on top of Volnay, which means that this particular vineyard I own 100% of. So it's a different example from Clos de Vougeot that Remington was talking about, or Champagne that I was talking about. In this particular instance, I am the only one to own that particular appellation of Volnay Premier Cru Clos des Ducs. That's why it says Monopole, single owner. And finally, I wanted to say that since vintage 12, we've started numbering the numbers, the bottles of Clos des Ducs. In 2012, we had a terrible hailstorm in Volnay, to the point that we had so little wine in Clos des Ducs that we bottled only magnums. And I decided to number the magnums to show that we had only produced 1,281 magnums in 2012. And that gave me the sense that it was probably a good idea to start actually numbering the labels of Clos des Ducs. And I've been doing that since vintage 12. So
fantastic.
Yeah.
Guillaume, I wasn't aware of how long the history went back with the actual logo, which is amazing. And Guillaume, I think there's one question here just on the Pommard, and then maybe after the Pommard, it would be nice to, I'm just also looking at the time and aware of what people have maybe got planned for the evening, but we're all on track, so it's great. And then we can go on to the Jura. But question from David was just regarding Pommard, which I think is a nice question, just broadly asking how you go about the sort of broad challenge of let's say a vineyard from another village and incorporating it into the sort of Volnay umbrella, if you like. How do you sort of go about that philosophically and in the winery?
I like that question very much because I often discuss the fact that I would be also interested to hear Remington's view on that, but I believe that there is a wine school that is village dependent, a winemaking school that is village dependent. In other words, when I make a pommard, I make it with a Volnesian style because it's in my genes. And when I make my Meursault Centenot, I don't make, I think if I gave my Meursault Centenot grapes to Dominique Lafont, he would make a different wine because he would make it with a Meursault style. And there is, the word of mouth works. In Volnay, for generations, we've been talking about making fine, elegant wines, precise wines, nothing unnecessary. My father used to use his hands like this. He said, get rid of what's unnecessary in the wine. And we have that willingness as a village to make that style of wine. And therefore, when I vinify my pommard, I vinify it with my hands of a Volnesian winemaker. And of course, it does make a difference to the end product. That's where the winemaker takes his share. Remington?
Yeah, am I on? Yeah. Guillaume, yes, look, I mean, can I turn that round? It's a very interesting question. I remember years ago that Philippe Angel exchanged a ton of Beaune Romanée grapes with Alain Bourget and Gevrey Chambertin and vice versa. And the Beaune grapes vinified in Gevrey tasted more like Gevrey, and the Gevrey vinified in Beaune tastes more like Beaune. Nobody's followed up on that experiment. There's a really good thesis there, but the thought was that the yeast population, ambient yeast population in cellars, determined in part, and I totally accept what you say about your perspective, your style, but the ambient yeast population in the cellar partly determined the conduct of fermentation, and that's something you really can't change. Do you have a view on that?
No, I agree entirely with that too. I think it's part of the reasoning as well. Definitely, there is something about the yeasts. I knew about that story about the exchange of grapes, but we should do that again. Actually, it would be interesting to do that.
Do it with somebody in Pommard.
So Guillaume, we're just going to have I think the tasting or the Tastinar wouldn't be complete without obviously having a good chat about what you've been involved with in more recent years, which is obviously your Jura project. And I think actually even more appropriate that Remington's here, because I think it was maybe my first or second bottle of the Pelican that we drank. I drank it with Remington in Johannesburg. And it was the Chardonnay, which was very Burgundian, Remington, if you remember that lunch that we had.
I absolutely do.
And I think that there's an amazing story behind how this project came about with obviously the link with Jacques Pouffenet, and obviously just a bit of elaboration on how it all came about. And Remington, anything you've got to add, of course.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, obviously the interesting experiment, but I think it's important to explain that the Jura is actually at the northern end of the Côte. I mean, how far is it from you to get from Volnay to your domain in Arbois, Guillaume?
It's an hour's drive, but it's across the Saône plain. Yeah.
Plain, yeah, absolutely. So this is not far away, but the styles of wine are different, and the sort of grapes they're growing up there are different. So yeah, sorry, yeah.
So yes. This project actually was born because I became very frustrated with the fact that I could not afford to acquire more land in Burgundy because the price of land was so high that I could not find an economical way of making a living out of new purchases. And yet I felt I could do something with my reputation as a winemaker and increase the volume of wine that I could put on the market. And therefore, I was looking to do something else outside of Burgundy, putting myself outside of my comfort zone, if you will, finding some new things which I had not been acquainted with before. And yet that I could absolutely, without lying, say that it was my wine. And therefore, it had to be close enough from Volnay that I could certify that if my name is on the label, it is for a reason. Remington may remember this from my father, but my father was adamant that you could not make wine by telephone. By that he meant, of course, you have to be in your vineyard all the time. And so that left me with a few options. One was Beaujolais, which had been done and redone. Chablis was another option, which was also quite done. But nobody had been to Jura from Burgundy. In fact, I was the first Burgundy guy to actually acquire land in Jura. And people opened very wide eyes when they saw me arrive, and they asked me what I was doing. And I said I wanted to create something from zero in Jura. In fact, I was served a white wine blind, which I mistook for a Burgundy Chardonnay. It was a Chardonnay, but it was a Chardonnay from Jura. Look at this beautiful view of the village of Montigny-les-Arceaux, where my winery is, my Jura winery is. This is a very diverse land. You know, it's very different from Burgundy because you can move from cows to wheat to corn and back to vineyards and back to wheat. It's a lot more diverse landscape. And it's a tiny vineyard area. There's only 2,000 hectares in total in Jura as a whole. So it's the equivalent of a couple of villages of Burgundy. So it's really very small. But the interesting point for me is that these wines have a lot of personality. There's 5 different grapes varieties in Jura. In red, there's Pinot Noir, of course, like Burgundy, Trousseau and Poulsard. And in white, there's Chardonnay, like in Burgundy, and Savagnin, which is the king white grape of Jura, with which they make this famous vin jaune, for which Jura is particularly well known. So I started buying in 2012. 2012 was my first harvest. This is my clos. This is not my house. It doesn't belong to me. It looks good, but the vineyard is mine, not the house. And this is Clos Saint Laurent, which is where my winery is just behind the person who took the picture there. I bought 5 hectares and then another 5 hectares in 2012. And then 3 years later, I was very honored and excited that Jacques Puffnet, whose nickname is the Pope of Arbois, so he's a very well-known guy. Jacques Puffnet had no heir apparent to take over the estate that he had built over time, his family estate, about 5 hectares. And he asked me if I was interested to take it over. And of course I was, because his vineyards were just around mine, very close by. I always have this sense of proximity, which is very important to me. So in Volnay, I can walk to all of my vineyards in 15 minutes. In Arbois, I can do the same. I can walk to everywhere in 15, 20 minutes. So it's a great area, and the wines have a lot of personality. They speak to you. They say something to you. That's what's important. You know, it's a different style from Burgundy, of course. You know, a Pinot Noir from Jura will never be equivalent to a Pinot Noir from Volnay, but the wines have personality. They speak to you. They give you emotion. And that's why I'm so attracted to this area. And I'm really excited by the project. We've now moved to a new level in 2018 because we now have 10 cuvées, 10 different cuvées with different varietals, with single vineyard cuvées, and also with some orange wines. We've made this year in 2018 a Savagnin, orange Savagnin, which is macerated like it was a red wine, but is made out of a white grape. So overall, it's about the same size as in Volnay, which makes sense because I know how to deal with an estate of about 15, 16 hectares. But it's in 5 different grapes and very many different styles of wines.
Guillaume, I was just thinking, just from a vineyard point of view, you obviously in Volnay are 100% biodynamic, if I'm not mistaken. That philosophy, is that something that you are carrying over into your Jura operation, or whereabouts are you in that sort of, from that point of view? Yeah,
in fact, it's impossible to be biodynamic in one side and not in the other. You know, biodynamic is like a philosophy. I went into biodynamic because I thought it was important for my soil. that was my first reasoning. It was I wanted to protect my soils because my soil is my wealth, and therefore I'm not going to destroy my soil by putting chemicals in it. That was my reasoning at the beginning. But then I discovered the impact on the wines, the energy in the wines that is different from before, the tension, and also the harmony. And in fact, when I purchased the first 5 hectares in Jura from a guy called François de Chavannes, he sold it to me. One of the reasons why he chose me as a buyer was because I was in biodynamic in Beaune, and he believed in that, and he wanted to sell to someone who had the same conviction. So yes, we have inherited that piece from François de Chavannes, which was in biodynamic. In fact, that particular vineyard that you see on the picture. And another piece I bought from a guy called Jean-Marc Brignot, who was into natural wines, so therefore no chemicals at all. Pufnay was into lutte raisonnée, as we call it, so was using chemicals. So we had to convert this piece. We converted it when we took it over.
Okay, and I suppose that one of the things you might not want to be reminded about, obviously vintages 12, 13, 14, obviously in Volnay there was massive destruction from a hail point of view. You had frost in 2016, so it's been a really, really tough, challenging time for you as a domain in Burgundy. And those sort of climatic challenges, are they sort of similar in Jura, or are you sort of slightly more protected there?
Frost, for example, frost is something that takes place, is particularly dangerous when there is sun, because the damage of the frost is when the bud is covered by ice during the night, and then the first ray of sun in the morning hits that coat of ice, which acts like a magnifier and burns the bud. Of course, in Jura, there's more clouds than there is in Burgundy, and so there's less sun, and therefore frost is not so damaging, and also it's slightly behind in terms of the seasoning, the vegetative cycle is slightly behind Burgundy. So late frost doesn't happen that much. So so far I have not been hit by frost in any significant way in Jura. Also for the reason, I should say that the reason why there's 5 different grapes in Jura is because they have different vegetative cycles, all these ones. For example, Savagnin is the latest to ripe, and therefore I think it's very smart from the part of the Jura people that they have those 5 varieties, because if one is hit by frost, it's likely that the others will not be. And it's kind of a hedge, talking in financial jargon, kind of a hedge, to those different varieties. But in terms of hailstorms, again, in Jura so far, we've been quite lucky. Over the last 8 years, we haven't suffered from any major disaster like we have in Volnay. Volnay has been hit, like you said, most badly in 12, but 13 and 14 were 2 years also with quite severe hailstorms. Again, cycles. So we don't know. We haven't seen now. That's also one reason why I chose vintage 17 today, because it's a vintage I particularly enjoy, because it's the first one after a long series of very small crops. Because 12, 13, 14 hailstorm, 15 was a drought, so very little wine in 15, and 16 was the frost, also quite badly hit in terms of volume. So 17 was like a kind of a miracle vintage after this difficult series. But the wines, the crops were small, but the wines are good. So it's only half a disaster, so to speak.
Just less of it to go around for us thirsty South Africans, but we completely understand. And Remington, you must have been following this sort of rejuvenation in the Jura, wherever you are, whether it's over in England or back here. You've sort of followed with interest what's going on there.
Well, I mean, yes, I think it has been a rejuvenation, but not so much as really as the rejuvenation in Volnay, because the quality, if I can go back to Volnay, of what's been coming out of particularly of Volnay, and people compare it, and I think the justification with Chambol Musigny in terms of elegance, and this idea that you get in these wines intensity but without weight. So important with Pinot Noir. You don't want weight, and it's sad that so many people who buy, and Guillaume was referring to the price hike in the Côte de Nuit, people who buy these very expensive Côte de Nuit wines really are expecting the more they pay, the louder the explosion or the bigger the taste bomb. And it's just not like that. I mean, Pinot Noir, as Volnay shows, as Chambol shows, wonderful intensity, but absolutely weightless. They're almost aerial, I think. And so, yeah, the Jura, I mean, there's some wonderful wines coming out of there. Guillaume, have you made a vin jaune yet?
I have started Remington, but you're going to have to wait until 2023.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know I'll be alive that long, but we'll have a go.
6.5 years in barrels before you can call it.
Oh, yeah. It's another style. Yeah.
Well, Guillaume, one of the quite fun bits of travel that happened not so long ago, and the first time I went to the Jura, I actually went with two high-profile South African winemakers who most of the people will know, Eben Sadi and Adi Badenhorst. And we went to the Jura just for fun to taste some wine, and we couldn't get an appointment at Monsieur Pouffernet, so we ended up driving to his address and probably quite rudely knocked on his door without an appointment, something we wouldn't normally do, but we were desperate. And we ended up having probably the most memorable tasting I can remember, because we walked into his cellar and I think he had just come back from the woods behind the house, and he had shot two little birds which were hanging in the cellar, and the blood was dripping on the floor. So it was all quite dramatic. And we had this incredibly emotional tasting where we could obviously see that he was very sad. Obviously there was a language barrier, but we had this amazing tasting. The wines were amazing. He let us buy a few bottles and we left. And the next day we woke up and I was sort of scrolling through my phone, and the news was released the next day that you had obviously acquired the land and that he didn't have anyone to succeed him. So that was my sort of very direct link with your project in the Jura, which is obviously very dear to me. And it's amazing. It's fantastic that someone like you've obviously got Monsieur Poufferet's vines. It couldn't be looked after by anyone better. So that was my story.
That's great. Yeah, I didn't remember. I don't know if you told me that before. I didn't remember that story. But you know, my winery is just 50 yards down the road from his. And of course, when I first arrived in Jura, I went to pay my respect to the Pope. You know, and that's when I first met him, when I arrived in 2012. And we developed a relationship over the years. And I suppose he trusted me. You know, I think he was reluctant to sell his estate to someone local, and he saw me as a acceptable alternative. And you know, I'm eternally grateful to him for this, of course, but also for the fact that he's around, and I speak to him regularly. I go visit him. I love spending time in his cellar, like you saw his tiny little cellar. Perhaps I will tell one quick anecdote. I said to him when I bought the estate from him, I said, please, part of the deal is that you teach me how to make vin jaune. And he said, yes, of course, I will teach you how to make vin jaune. And so the following year, I go to see him and I say, so Jacques, what's your word of wisdom about making this vin jaune? This was vintage 15. I wanted to try my first vin jaune. So he said, very simple. You put wine in the barrel, you wait 6.5 years, and then you have vin jaune. So I said, say that again. Yeah, you put wine in the barrel, you wait 6.5 years, and then you have vin jaune. I said, Jacques, I think you have to work a little harder on this one. Sure enough, my first vintage of vin jaune, which was 15, I had to get rid of because volatile acidity went through the roof all of a sudden. I didn't know what to do, and it had to go down the bin. But 16, I learned from my failure of the previous year, and also Jacques took more care of me. And 16, 17, 18, 19, I have now 4 vintages of vin jaune in process, and of course 16 will be out in 23. Yeah, so it'll be fun.
We're looking forward to the release of that. That should be lots of fun. But Guillaume, it's been amazing. We've gone through a lot in a short space of time, and it's I'm not sure if there are any other questions that have come through, or if Remington's got anything to sign off with. I'm just looking at the time and don't want to. I could sit here for the next 3 hours and talk and drink some wine, but Remington, I don't know if you've got anything to add as we sort of near closing off.
No, I mean, I just encourage everybody to try Volnay wines. Volnay is lucky in having 3 stellar producers, and I'm sure Guillaume would agree with me. 3.5 stellar producers, but Lafarge, yourself, and de Monti. And but the quantities of wine are small, but do try them, because when they're good, they are fantastic wines. And there is what the French will call a rapport qualité-prix. In terms of what you would buy in Chambon-Musigny in the Côte de Nuits, there is value there. They are still expensive, but there is value to be had. And so, yeah, Guillaume, thank you for being part of it, and thank you for producing such lovely wines.
Remington, the idea that you and I shared that session together is literally fantastic. It gives me an enormous amount of pleasure. Wow. I know you knew my father well. You've written great things about my estate in the past in your book. So it's really it's great to share this session with you. So thank you, Derek.
Well, thank you, Guillaume. We've and for those that are still listening, we'll be sending a short email out to everyone that's joined us or registered for the Tastinar regarding the Domaine Pelican wines, which is something that we really encourage people to try. It's something different, and as Guillaume said, there's a kaleidoscope of flavors. They're different to Burgundy, which is what the attraction is. So we encourage you to do, as I say, try some of the bottles. And then more importantly, Remington, thanks so much all the way from Somerset West. I hope you managed to get back to England when so you could have your session there for the year when we're allowed to fly again. And then Guillaume, myself, and Wayne, and with a bit of luck, Venetia, we hope to see you at the Domain sometime in the near future, and really appreciate your time and insights. It's been really fantastic, and we value it, and obviously our relationship. So look after yourselves, and I'm sure we'll see you all soon.
Thank you very much. Very nice talking to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Au revoir, Guillaume.
Bye-bye. Au revoir. Bye-bye.